Imagine waking up beneath a tree and discovering that the rain has been falling for 3 days. Your blanket is animal skin. Your roof is leaves. Your weather app is a frog that has looked worried since Tuesday. The obvious answer is that ancient humans simply found a cave and waited. Convenient. Also mostly wrong. Caves were scarce, often occupied, and sometimes turned into excellent stone bathtubs when water began running downhill. Surviving long wet seasons required more than hiding. People had to keep one patch of ground dry, protect fuel before the storm arrived, raise sleeping material above mud, preserve body heat, and know when the landscape itself was telling them to leave. A wet shelter was uncomfortable. Wet bedding, wet firewood, and a wet body could become a survival system collapsing one miserable piece at a time. The strangest evidence does not come from a prehistoric raincoat. Those usually rotted away. It comes from ash beneath grass beds, microscopic wear on hide-working tools, hearths protected inside shelters, and wooden structures preserved only because water refused to let them decay. So, how did humans survive when the sky seemed broken? Not with one invention. With an entire technology of staying dry enough. Let's go back to the first leak. The short answer is that ancient humans built layers between themselves and the water. First came location. A shelter on slightly higher ground was better than a magnificent roof placed in what would soon become a river. Then came overhead cover branches, bark, grass, leaves, hides, or rock and a barrier below. Because a dry head does not help much when your entire body is lying on saturated soil. They raised sleeping material, guarded hearths, protected fuel, and wrapped themselves in materials that slowed heat loss. If the camp became too wet, smoky, unstable, or close to rising water, they moved. That was the system. Not waterproof. Not comfortable. Just less wet in several strategically important places. And that distinction mattered. A roof could leak while the bedding remained usable. The outer pieces of a wood pile could soak while the center stayed dry enough to burn. A hide could become damp without allowing wind to strip heat directly from the skin. One defense could fail without dragging every other defense down with it. But this answer creates a larger question. Why was rain so dangerous that humans needed an entire network of small solutions? After all, we are not made of sugar. Getting wet does not dissolve us. Unfortunately, the human body has several other design flaws. Rain does not need to freeze you to become dangerous. Water carries heat away from the body more efficiently than still air. Once your skin, hair, clothing, or bedding becomes soaked, the warm layer of air trapped beside your body begins to disappear. Add wind, and the process accelerates. Your body narrows blood vessels near the skin and makes your muscles shiver. Shivering is useful. It is also expensive. Those contractions burn calories needed for walking, hunting, healing, producing milk, or simply remaining alert enough not to place the fire beneath the most flammable part of the roof. And the colder you become, the harder it is to solve the problem. Fingers lose precision. Knots become difficult. Stone tools slip. Wet branches must be split, carried, scraped, and arranged by hands becoming steadily less cooperative. The human body is essentially a leaking furnace operated by an anxious thermostat. Then there is sleep. A person lying on damp ground loses heat from below. Poor sleep means slower reactions, worse judgment, lower endurance, and less patience the next morning. An unfortunate combination when the roof needs repairs and everyone believes somebody else was supposed to collect firewood. In warmer climates, the danger could look different. Constant moisture, softened skin, irritated wounds, encouraged insects, damaged stored food, and made shelters harder to keep sanitary. Rain did not create the same problem everywhere, but in every environment, it interfered with recovery. That is why shelter was not merely a place to sit until the weather improved. It protected the body's ability to keep working, which makes the usual explanation they lived in caves far too simple. The cave explanation survives because it sounds efficient. Caves have roofs. Stone walls block wind. Deep chambers can remain more stable in temperature than the open air. Some also place a group near water, game trails, or useful stone. Find the right cave in the right landscape, and it is an excellent answer. That is a very large if. Most people did not live in a world where a clean, empty cave appeared whenever the weather became unpleasant. Many regions had few caves or none at all. Others had rock shelters that blocked rain from one direction while wind drove it in from another. Water could still run down walls or across floors. Then there was smoke. A fire deep inside a poorly ventilated space could turn shelter into a breathing problem. Move it closer to the entrance, and wind or rain could weaken it. Ancient housing already had design compromises. It simply had fewer building inspectors. Caves also came with existing tenants. Bears, hyenas, leopards, snakes, and other humans all understood the value of a roof. Arriving second required negotiation, and prehistoric predators were not famous for flexible lease agreements. More importantly, caves rarely followed the food. Human groups moved through landscapes shaped by migrating animals, seasonal plants, water sources, and raw materials. Staying permanently inside one protected location could mean remaining dry while slowly running out of everything else. So, open-air camps were not failed versions of cave life. They were essential. That changes the archaeological problem. Stone survives. Bone sometimes survives. Wood, grass, bark, cord, and hide usually disappear. The shelters people depended on most were built from the materials archaeology is worst at preserving. And this is where a handful of crushed grass becomes more informative than an entire stone wall. The clue is not a roof. It is a crushed layer of grass so thin that, for most of human history, nobody would have recognized it as anything at all. At Border Cave, a rock shelter on the border between South Africa and Eswatini, archaeologists examined sediments from occupation layers dating back at least 200,000 years. Under a microscope, they found traces of broad-leafed grasses gathered in bundles and placed toward the rear of the shelter. These were not random plants blown in by the wind. They formed deliberate surfaces where people probably slept, rested, and worked. That sounds like a small domestic improvement. It was not. Bare cave floors are hard, cold, uneven, and excellent at transferring dampness into the body. A layer of grass traps air, softens the surface, and creates distance from dirt, sharp stone, and moisture. It does not create a luxury hotel. It turns the ground from an active enemy into a manageable inconvenience. Some grass bedding at Border Cave was placed over layers of ash. Researchers have suggested that ash may have helped discourage crawling insects because fine powder can obstruct their movement. There is also evidence that old bedding was sometimes burned, perhaps as part of cleaning and maintaining the living area. So this was not simply a pile of weeds dropped once and forgotten. People were arranging space, replacing material, and maintaining a surface they used repeatedly, housekeeping roughly 200,000 years before anyone could complain that nobody else ever changes the sheets. But caution matters here. Border Cave does not prove that the bedding was invented to survive a rainy season. It does not preserve a waterproof floor, and we cannot ask its occupants whether comfort, insects, cold, dampness, cleanliness, or all of these mattered most. What it shows is more fundamental. Humans were not merely accepting whatever surface nature provided. They were engineering the tiny zone where the body met the landscape. And once that idea exists, the next step is enormous. Instead of improving the ground with grass, what if you begin rebuilding the ground itself? For that, we need to visit a waterfall in Zambia and a pair of logs that should have disappeared nearly 500,000 years ago. At Kalambo Falls in Zambia, water preserves something it usually destroys. Buried in waterlogged sediment, archaeologists found two pieces of wood joined at right angles. One log had been cut with a deep notch so it could rest securely across the other. Stone tools had shaped the surfaces. The marks were deliberate. The structure dates to roughly 476,000 years ago. That is hundreds of thousands of years before the earliest known Homo sapiens. We do not know which hominin species made it. We also do not know exactly what they were building. It may have been part of a platform, walkway, foundation, or some larger structure rising above wet ground. Calling it a house would be tempting. It would also be more certainty than the evidence allows. What matters is the decision behind it. Someone looked at tree trunks and saw more than fuel, clubs, or branches. They understood that wood could be cut, fitted, and locked into a stable arrangement. Instead of standing on whatever surface the landscape provided, they altered that surface. The ground was no longer allowed to be management. This required planning. Suitable wood had to be selected, cut, transported, and notched so the pieces would fit. The builder had to imagine the arrangement before the work was complete. Kalambo Falls sits beside water. where fertile resources could attract repeated occupation, but damp soil and shifting surfaces could make living difficult. A raised or stabilized structure would have created a more usable zone in that environment. Again, we cannot say it was designed specifically for rain. The preserved logs do not come with architectural labels. But they reveal a much older capacity. Hominins were building large wooden structures and modifying wet landscapes nearly 500,000 years ago. Normally, such evidence disappears. Wood rots, organisms consume it, and archaeology is left holding another stone tool while wondering where the rest of the world went. At Kalambo, permanent saturation slowed that decay. The water that made the landscape difficult also protected the evidence. And once humans could rebuild the surface beneath them, survival in rain became less about finding shelter and more about constructing a usable zone. A working rain shelter was not just a roof, it was a sequence. First, choose ground that would not become a pond. Elevation, slope, soil, wind direction, and the path of runoff all mattered. A beautiful campsite in dry weather could become a drainage channel by morning. Then came the cover. Branches created a frame. Grass, leaves, bark, or hide could be layered over it. The roof needed enough slope for water to run off rather than collect overhead until gravity made a dramatic entrance. But rain also creeps sideways through wind, drips along supports, and rises from saturated soil. People needed a usable floor, anything that separated bodies and tools from mud. The hearth added another problem. Too far inside, it filled the shelter with smoke. Too close to the edge, rain weakened it. Fuel had to be collected early and stored so the driest material remained protected. Even then, the shelter demanded maintenance. Leaves shifted, lashings loosened, hides stretched, channels clogged, bedding absorbed moisture. A prehistoric roof did not come with a warranty. It came with a daily subscription paid entirely in labor. That is why these structures were probably built first for practical survival, reducing heat loss, protecting sleep, preserving fire, keeping food and tools usable, and allowing people to remain near important resources without surrendering to the weather. No single layer had to be perfect. The roof slowed the rain. The floor slowed the damp. The fire restored heat. The bedding protected sleep. Stored fuel bought time. Together, they created continuity, the ability to wake up the next morning and keep functioning. A shelter could protect the group while they were inside it. The problem began the moment someone had to leave. Rain-soaked hair ran down skin and let wind pull heat from the body. Animal hides offered another layer of defense. Draped over the shoulders, wrapped around the torso, spread across bedding, or stretched over a frame, they could block wind and slow the movement of water toward the skin. But a fresh hide is not a ready-made jacket. It contains fat, tissue, and moisture. Left untreated, it stiffens, rots, smells impressive, and attracts organisms that consider your clothing a buffet. Preparing it required scraping, drying, stretching, and repeatedly working the fibers until the material became softer and more flexible. Stone scrapers could do part of that work. Neanderthals also used something more specialized. At sites in southwestern France, archaeologists found shaped pieces of deer rib known as lissoirs. Their rounded, polished tips matched tools traditionally used to press and soften dry hides. The artifacts were found in Neanderthal contexts dating to roughly 50,000 years ago, before modern humans became established in Western Europe. That does not give us a preserved Neanderthal raincoat. A lissoir can reveal how a material was worked, not whether the finished hide became a cloak, sleeping mat, shelter cover, or something else. Still, it shows that another kind of human understood a crucial principle. Survival depended not only on finding useful materials, but on changing their physical properties. A hide could become softer, warmer, easier to wrap, and more effective at blocking wind. It was probably never perfectly waterproof. Neither are many modern jackets after several hours in serious rain. The goal was not perfection. It was buying enough warmth and enough time to reach the fire again. A dry shelter was never just a pile of branches. It was shared infrastructure. Someone had to choose the site, cut poles, gather grass, carry hides, watch the fire, replace bedding, move food, and notice when water began cutting a new path toward the sleeping area. Children, injured adults, and anyone weakened by cold or hunger still needed protection. That made shelter a social problem. The driest place near the fire was limited. So was the best bedding. So was the protected space where fuel, tools, and food could be stored. Groups had to decide through habit, status, care, conflict, or some mixture of all four, who occupied which part of the shelter and who performed which task. We cannot reconstruct a prehistoric seating chart. Archaeology is powerful, but it rarely preserves an argument about who moved the wet firewood. Still, organized living spaces show that people did more than gather beneath a roof. They created zones. Fire here, sleeping material there, tool making farther from small hands, waste outside, dry fuel where nobody would accidentally use it as a pillow. Knowledge also became social property. You had to know which grasses stayed springy, which bark peeled cleanly, which branches bent without snapping, where water collected, and how wind shifted around a cliff or valley. That knowledge had to be observed, remembered, and passed on. A shelter therefore carried invisible architecture, rules, responsibilities, memory, and trust. And that is where protection from rain became more than survival engineering. It became a language of belonging. Maintaining the roof said, "I am helping this group remain here." Keeping the fire alive said, "There will still be heat when the others return." Making room for someone weaker said something even older, "You are worth keeping dry." But a shelter that saves you today can trap you tomorrow. Rain changes landscapes while people are sleeping. Streams widen, riverbanks collapse. Water begins cutting new channels through familiar ground. A campsite chosen carefully in dry weather may slowly become an island, then a pool, then a place everyone should have left several hours earlier. Shelters create problems of their own. A roof tight enough to block rain may also trap smoke. A fire that keeps bodies warm can fill a poorly ventilated space with soot and irritating gases. Damp bedding grows heavier, dirtier, and less insulating. Stored food attracts insects and animals. Waste accumulates near places where people eat and sleep. And the longer a group remains crowded beneath limited cover, the more every small failure matters. One leaking seam wets the bedding. Wet bedding forces people closer to the hearth. More people near the hearth disturb the fire and increase smoke. Fuel disappears faster. Someone opens the shelter to improve ventilation, and wind drives rain inside. The survival system can collapse in reverse order. This is why mobility was not evidence that a shelter had failed. Sometimes leaving was the final function of the shelter strategy. People had to read water levels, softened soil, animal movement, damaged vegetation, and the sound of runoff in darkness. They had to decide whether to repair, relocate uphill, or abandon the camp while tools, food, children, and burning material could still be carried. Waiting too long could turn familiar ground into a hazard. The river was simply revising the property boundary. Ancient humans survived prolonged rain partly because they could build places worth staying in, and partly because they understood that no place was worth staying in forever. So, how did ancient humans survive relentless rain? The honest answer is that we do not have one preserved shelter, one species, or one invention that explains everything. We know that hominins were modifying wet landscapes with worked wood nearly 500,000 years ago. Later, humans arranged grass bedding, maintained hearths, and replaced dirty or damp materials. Neanderthals and Homo sapiens both developed specialized ways to process hides. What this strongly suggests is a layered strategy. Choose ground carefully. Build overhead cover. Separate the body from wet soil. Protect fire and fuel. Prepare insulating materials. Maintain the shelter. Cooperate. Leave when the landscape becomes too dangerous. What remains uncertain is the exact shape of most shelters, how waterproof their covers were, and which purpose mattered most at any specific site. A wooden platform might have supported a dwelling, a walkway, or something else entirely. Grass bedding could provide warmth, comfort, cleanliness, insect control, or several benefits at once. And there was probably no first person who suddenly invented rain survival. One group improved a floor. Another learned which bark overlapped without leaking. Someone protected embers overnight. Someone noticed that a campsite remained dry after every storm because water drained away from it. Small solutions accumulated. That is the real answer. Ancient humans survived endless rain not by defeating water, but by making sure it never reached every vulnerable part of their lives at the same time. Right now, you are probably sitting inside the most advanced version of the same survival system. Your roof redirects water. Your walls slow wind. Your floor separates you from saturated soil. Insulation traps warm air. Pipes carry water away. Cupboards protect food. A furnace, heater, or electrical grid performs the work once assigned to a carefully guarded hearth. Even your clothing follows the old logic. It does not need to make you invulnerable. It only needs to keep enough warmth near the body for long enough to get you somewhere safer. We have changed the materials. We have not changed the problem. And when modern systems fail, the ancient layers become visible again. A blocked drain sends water toward the floor. A power outage removes heat. A leaking roof threatens bedding, tools, food, and sleep. Suddenly, the building stops feeling like a permanent object and starts feeling like what every shelter has always been: a collection of defenses requiring maintenance. The frog has been replaced by satellites, radar, notifications, and a phone that can warn you about rain while you are standing in it. But ancient humans would understand the important part immediately. Do not let the roof, floor, fuel, food, and body fail together. They never conquered rain. Neither have we. They simply learned to make water pass through layer after layer of resistance before it could reach the fragile human animal underneath. And whenever the system begins to fail, the question is still the same one it was beneath that first dripping tree. Where is the first leak?